very much. So next I have the honor to introduce our state senator for the 42nd Legislative District, which includes Point Roberts, Sharon Shewmake. Sharon was elected to the Senate last November, but is no stranger or newcomer to Point Roberts, having served previously as a representative in the Washington House of
Yay.
Representatives. And also she happens to be a property owner here on the Point. And she joined the Taxpayers Association last year. I think I pressured her into it. I hope she renewed. I think you did renew. Okay, so also a member of the association. She's a professor of environmental economics, urban economics, and energy policy at Western Washington University, as well as a children's book author and mother of 2 young boys. In the Senate, she serves as vice chair of the Transportation Committee and on the Senate Housing Committee and the Senate Agriculture, Water, Natural Resources, and Parks Committee. So please welcome Senator Sharon Shewmake.
Yay. Yeah, I do need sunglasses. I feel like a shady politician wearing sunglasses. So thank you all for having me. When Mark asked me to do this, I thought, gosh, usually when I go to Point Roberts, you guys tell me what's up. How am I supposed to talk to everyone else and give a keynote? So I thought what would be helpful is, a lot of times when I tell people I'm an economist, nobody has any idea what that means. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about economics and how that has led me to start thinking about public policy. And so one of the reasons I like to have this talk is, when I decided to become a college professor, I was a student. I wanted to be an ecologist, and then the pre-med majors were just a little too intense for me, and I realized what I really wanted to do was environmental policy. I thought of my professors as like wizards from some class of people that, you had to know a professor to be a professor. Like, that never seemed like a job that a normal girl could go ahead and do until I realized, gosh, that's what I want to do, when I became it. And so I always try and reach out to my students that way and let them see themselves that way. And, politics seemed even more that way. I remember the first time I met a politician, I had no idea what to say to them. It just seemed like such a different thing to do. And so my introduction to politics was on accident. I ran for office because nobody else was going to do it. And I felt like every political race, you need to have challengers, right? Like, democracy is about choices. And so I just gotten tenure. My husband was a stay-at-home dad. And I was like, well, I'm an economist. I study people. I'll study people for a summer and I'll learn about it. And then I'll go back, and then I won on accident. Not on accident, but, I was like, what have I done? And so one of the things I really love about Point Roberts is how much you all engage and how much I hear from you, and never feel bad complaining to your local elected leaders, because if you don't tell me what's not working, I can't fix it, frankly. And so that is just a critical component of it. Never apologize. So I titled this, you always need a snappy title for something, and I have an economist goes to the legislature. And first of all, I wanted to talk about what economics is, and it's really the science of choice. I am used to teaching on an hour and 15 minutes with a PowerPoint, and there are just some graphics on here, so I made you a mini PowerPoint with some slides that should be on your table. If they're not, Mark can pass more out. But so this science of choice, so how do people and how do firms make decisions? How do you can even do how do nonprofits make decisions? What are the things that you're thinking about when I decide to get the salmon versus the beef versus the veggie burger? What are my parameters there? And how is Nick figuring out what to serve you? And then what I think is really interesting is once you build a model of how people make decisions, what are the outcomes of all of us making different decisions together, right? And that's the standard supply and demand, where all the demanders are your consumers and the supplies are your firms. But then also, how can we predict what kind of decisions make? And then, can we do better? And what is better? And what is better is something that's very value-based to you. I need to work with moral philosophers to figure out, I need to work with the public to figure out, what are your goals? Do you want to better protect the environment, or do you want to have something, I'm with you. How are you thinking about equity? How are you thinking about the distribution of resources in your community? What are you looking to do? And one of the reasons that I became an economist is I was working in environmental policy, and all the environmental classes were so depressing. And economics had answers. They were answers politicians hate, and now I get why. But it had answers and solutions, and when they had an answer, they also went out and they tested it with data and evidence. And I thought that was so compelling, that instead of just someone saying, you know, if you build it over there, this is gonna happen, and that just being someone's opinion and you could fight with them or not, we actually went out and we had our theories, and then we went out and we gathered a bunch of data of other things that people had done and whether or not building more homes really does lower rents, whether or not charging more for X means that people use less of it. And so I thought that was exciting. I love people, and so I thought it was a really fun field to be in. The other thing that I really love about environmental economics is you're often talking about some sort of scientific system. Like my advisor did fisheries economics, so you get to learn all about the biology of fisheries, but I don't actually have to be a fisheries scientist. And so I loved getting to learn about science, but I hated doing science. I had a few lab jobs where I was like, if I see another root core, I'm gonna lose my mind. And so bless the people that want to do that. That was not my interest. And so environmental economics was this really fun field where I research how do people make decisions about housing and transportation and how they impact the environment. And it was a really great way for me to learn about building science and transportation science and air pollution science and all of these different pieces. And I thought it was so much fun, but it didn't make me go to a lab. Instead, I got to talk to people and run surveys and ask people how they think. And it fit the kind of things that I was interested in. And so if you go to the third slide, one of the things that I think people don't understand about economics enough is how we can tackle really, like, you think it's all about money and numbers and how to run your business, but I'm an environmental economist. Like, I wanted to study how do we protect the environment cost effectively and know what programs work. We can also tell you about super controversial topics. I talk about abortion in this one because I think it's kind of shows that you can kind of take some of the morality out, but how do economists deal with something that has a big moral component? An economist cannot tell you when a fetus becomes a life, but we can talk to you about some of the consequences of the policies around abortion. So whether you think abortion is ending life or whether you think it's absolutely a woman's choice in her body, either way, that's not for economics to decide, but we still can guide some of that policy making. And so, you know, we can also talk about questions like, well, how do we reduce the need for abortions, right? Like, what are the policies that are actually effective? A lot of times people talk about sexual health education or abstinence education or all of these different things. Like, well, which ones actually work, right? Like, it doesn't have to just come from your own biases, but we should try them out and figure out which works. And then what are the impact of policies that ban or restrict access to abortion? And you might be thinking, Sharon, how do I know these aren't just your own biases? And every time someone does empirical work, they gather data and evidence and they make conclusions, there are probably some biases in there, right? Like, economists are still humans just like everyone else, but we really do try to let the data teach us. And I will tell you, every time I do research, I am wrong all over the place. And that is when you learn, Arthur and I were just talking about that. When you are wrong as a social scientist or as a scientist, it means that you've learned something that day. So if you look at that page 5, not page 5, slide 4, the credibility revolution, we might want to know, okay, there's this hypothesis out there that access to abortion results in higher wages and economic prospects for women. And depending on where your biases are, you might be, yeah, that's true. And if you think that, you know, and you might think that that's true, but still not think that access to abortion is a good thing, right? Like, there's all sorts of value statements that you could make there. And I'm not going to judge that as an economist. But then how do we analyze that? And so if you flip over, you'll see slide number 5, there's a randomized control trial. And this is what we know from research trials, right? Like, this is what the pharmaceuticals do. They give you drug X and everyone else gets drug Y, and we see if there's the difference, right? And sometimes we actually can do that with social science. It's really exciting when we can do that, but oftentimes it's not like we can give some people access to abortion and other people not access to abortion and just randomize who gets access to it. But there are things where we can do that. So instead, we have to use data that already exists. And if you go to the next slide, the credibility revolution. So you might worry that access to abortion does result in higher wages and economic prospects for women. But also there's this other factor, and that's that bigger blurb, where living in a community with greater access to healthcare and economic opportunities. So there are communities with greater access to healthcare and economic opportunities, and guess what? Women are probably going to have better outcomes, wages, and economic prospects. And often, if you have just access to healthcare, you're more likely to have access to abortion, right? So when we see that access to abortion causes higher wages and economic prospects for women, are we really sure it's not this other thing that's having those, right? And so we would call it a confounding variable. And so the way that economists deal with it is we look for, if you look on the next slide, some sort of outside influence, like something that changes your access to abortion but isn't necessarily associated with all these other things that we think might raise it. And through that, we can kind of, if you look along the red arrows, we can say outside influence influences access to abortion, and that change in access to abortion, can we measure that impact of that change only on the higher wages and economics prospects for women? And this is a lot of what we do in economics research. This has been part of this credibility revolution where we try not to just say things that fit my own biases, but we actually try and apply data and evidence to it in clever ways. The other way that we look at this too is sometimes we look at something called a differences in differences approach. It's very sensitive. Where if you look at my little graph below, so you see there's two groups of women. What if I hold it? Is this better? Yeah, I felt like a rock star too. There's two groups of women, the purple and the orange ones, and they have pretty similar impacts over time. They make similar amounts of money, and then some sort of event means that group purple has access to abortion and group orange doesn't. And so we're able to see that even though they were similar before and then this event changed something about their access to abortion, we saw things change along with it, right? And so we're able to measure that change. And so if we try and figure out, we have some pretty good evidence on that if you go to the next page. So some of the differences in differences results that we look at. So before Roe, the Supreme Court decision legalizing abortion, which we then had the next Supreme Court decision recently, a number of states already had legalized abortion. So can we look at those states? Can we look at women living in those states and states that hadn't legalized abortion, follow them through time and see what the impacts are? And what we see is before Roe, all these states, Washington, California, Alaska, Hawaii, New York City, and DC, when they legalized abortion, it led to a 4 to 11% decline in births relative to the rest of the nation, especially in teens of women of color. So you would expect that if you have access to safe abortion, then you're probably going to have fewer pregnancies that go to term, right? Because people are making decisions about that. It reduced the number of teen mothers by 34%. It reduced teen brides by 20%, and it reduced maternal mortality in black women by 30 to 40%. And this is not saying that that's why abortion is great. If you think abortion is taking a human life, then that doesn't really matter to you, and I will respect your decision. I am pro-choice, in case you're wondering, but I'm not trying to pander. I'm just trying to let people know how economists think about things. These are things that we should be thinking about, right? Like if what you're arguing for is lower access to abortion, then you probably want to be aware of the consequences of those decisions. The other thing that we have is turnaway studies where you have people that are pretty similar. So sometimes there will be restrictions at 3 months. And you wonder, okay, if someone who is 1 day away from being 3 months pregnant, are they really that different from someone who is 1 day after 3 months pregnant? I would argue no. They'll sometimes look at some of that in the data. They generally find that they're not. And so they're able to look at those women over time too. And so they looked at these two groups of women. They started with similar credit scores. Women who sought an abortion but were turned away saw a 70% increase in past due rent, 81% increase in bankruptcies, evictions, and other court records, right? So there are financial consequences to this. And again, you should know those, whatever you feel about the morality of abortion, is that we should be thinking about these consequences. And maybe if you do want to reduce abortions, you need to make sure that women who are pregnant have access to financial means and they get some sort of support if you want to reduce these impacts. Like I've said many times, I'm talking as an empirical social scientist. Economists can be pro-life or pro-choice. I know economists that are pro-life. They can and they should delve into moral philosophy, but economics is not going to tell you that story of when a fetus, a clump of cells, or whatever you want to talk about, it becomes a life. You're going to need a pastor or a rabbi or someone else to tell you that. Another thing that we would say too that you often hear economists talking about is, well, 30 to 50% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, often before the woman even knows they're pregnant. And that 50% is actually coming from some new data. And so if you really think that that is the same weight as a human at some point, maybe we should be doing more work to discourage miscarriages or more work on miscarriage work. are we underinvesting in that reducing miscarriage? If you flip to the next page, it's enough abortion talk. We can have all sorts of discussions about big issues in the legislature. So taxes, public safety, affordability, housing, climate and environmental issues, education, social insurance. I have colleagues that study all of these things just at Western. So we are applied social scientists, and we'll look at things, well, how much does education increase wages? One of my colleagues had some work that found that if you are a student from a marginalized group, having a teacher that looks like you actually is better for you than if you don't, right? Like that can be an important thing for a kid, is having someone, if you're a black boy, having a black man as one of your teachers can be a really important part of your educational progress. One of the things that has been, a hot political topic and something very near and dear to my heart is housing and homelessness. And so if we were to talk about that issue from an economic perspective, we would want to know, what are your value statements, right? So this is something that you'd be asking community members, you'd be reading newspapers, you'd be trying to figure out. And I wrote a whole bunch of different value statements, some of which are conflicting, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't personally. So you might think everyone should have a safe place to live, or maybe you should only have housing if you work really hard and pay for it, right? Is there an inherent value in having communities that are economically integrated, or are we kind of okay with the rich suburbs and the poor places, right? Like, is that the natural state of affairs and we should have that? If you bought a home in a neighborhood in 1997, should you be guaranteed that that neighborhood stays the same? Do you have a right to do with what your land, right? And so some of these are value statements that you might hold to some extent or be willing to compromise, but these are things that some people think are important and how they think about the question. So one of the things that we see with housing and homelessness, though, is so much of homelessness is the consequence of really expensive rent. And it's the consequence of not having really cheap places to live for a certain population. And so I have two graphs there. The first one is you see a vacancy rate from 0 to 14%, and then on the y-axis there's the rate of homelessness. And you can kind of see that the higher the vacancy rate, that means that there's more apartments that are vacant, that means there's more opportunities, it means that renters have a little bit more power in these conversations with landlords. That is a good tenant protection, and it reduces homelessness. Communities with very low vacancy rates, it is very easy to fall into homelessness. The next graph shows median rent on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, it's rate of homelessness. And you see that higher median rents also increase homelessness. And that's just because if you are on the margin and poor and something happens to you and you don't have $400, that can cause you to become homeless. And so we see that there are, a lot of times people will talk about homelessness, they'll say, oh, it's drug addiction, it's mental illness, it's because we closed all the institutions, but we see very different communities with higher levels of homelessness and lower levels of homelessness. And if you go to the next slide, slide 17, they put mental illness and homelessness. And you see communities have different rates of mental illness. It's all over the area on the x-axis, but there doesn't seem to be a strong relationship. That there are communities with high levels of mental illness and lower homelessness rates because there are cheap places to live and you don't end up being forced onto the street. There are more opportunities for you to be safe there. So when we talk about homelessness, we absolutely need behavioral health facilities. We absolutely need rehab. We absolutely need to look at the way all of our systems can contribute to homelessness, but if we don't tackle housing affordability, we will continue to we will just be trying to catch up. We will not be able to treat it, and we will not be able to get ahead of it. And so one of the things that I find so frustrating about homelessness is that this is a problem that we created over many, many years of underbuilding. And I'm sorry, but it is going to take many years to build enough low-income affordable homes to really get out of it. We have about 1,000 people that are unhoused in Whatcom County right now. You think, oh, well, we just need to build 1,000 low-income homes. Yes, we do, but there will be new people that are continuing to fall into homelessness, and until we can get a suite of low-cost available units to live in. And so that might be single-room occupancy, it might be little shacks, it might be accessory dwelling units, it might be all sorts of different things that people might want to live in that can kind of catch them before they end up sleeping in a camp or in their car. And so it is an economics talk. I am an economist. I'm going to have to show you supply and demand. Sorry about that. But on the x-axis on that next graph, we have the number of homes. And on the y-axis, we have, some funny symbols. It meant to say rent and some numbers. And I printed out kind of funny. And so the the orange line is demand, and then the next, goodness, they really did print out funny. The purple line is if demand were to have some sort of boost, right? And so we just saw, Point Roberts is having kind of a different experience, but in Bellingham and other parts of Whatcom County, a lot of people decided to move there, and it's been really, there's been a big increase in demand as a result of COVID. And so one of the things that you'll notice about the supply curve is that it's kind of funny, right? It's a little kinked right there. And that's because if you have people moving away, you still have their homes, right? It's not like you just move them to another community where they're needed, or you stop producing homes. They're still there, and landlords don't usually, raise them immediately. And so that line is less flexible, less elastic than the line going forward. So the line to the left is pretty steep. It means that it's pretty inflexible. You're not going to get rid of those homes, even if the price drops. You're just going to drop your rent and kind of deal with it. Hopefully you recoup your costs. And then the line to the right is how people can build new homes. And the flatter it is, the flatter that line is, that means it's easier for them to build new homes. That if you have a big change in price, then people are going to build a whole bunch of new homes. If you have a really steep line, then that means a big change in price, they're not really going to change much. They're not able to respond as much. And so when we look at housing, the next slide has kind of that blue line, but then I left, there's a ghost line for what it is, and then I made it really, really inflexible. And so you can see the difference of what happens if we have the light blue line versus the dark line. If it's the light blue line and it's easy to build homes, yeah, an increase in demand increases rents. But if you make it really hard to build homes, then an increase in demand increases rents by a lot more. And so I think that one of the biggest parts of our homeless situation is not being able to build enough homes. And we need to figure out as a community, this is my value statement, but it's also coming from, if you think homelessness is a problem and you want to solve it, then we need to build homes. And the big way that I think that we should build homes is we need to make it easier, and especially in cities. I think Point Roberts is kind of a unique community where there's some need to build it in cities, but especially I don't want to see people building homes, especially on dangerous floodplains, and there's a lot of issues when they start building into forests. They're more susceptible to wildfires. Another concern I have too is we have parts of East County where they were kind of chased out of Bellingham by the high rents. Those folks are uniquely vulnerable to changes in gas prices because they are driving back and forth. And those are often the communities that don't have $400 to fix their car. So when something happens to them, when the price of gas goes up, I worry about that. And I think we do better if we build enough in cities. And so I just have a few more slides. This little blue box is my fake introductory house. So the lot is worth about $300,000. The house costs about $300,000 to build, and so you have a $600,000 home, which right now would feel affordable in Bellingham. But however, if we were to split that lot into two, if you were to go to the next page, now what we have is it still costs you money to build those homes, but you're able to fit two on a lot, and now suddenly we can do it for $450,000. And if we allow for even more density, somehow you can get so the home price can be below $300,000. And so just on the supply and the cost side, we're able to fit more people in a space by allowing for a little bit more density. And that's how you build that affordability. It's not saying that people still can't live on the big homes, on the big lots. That's still acceptable. They're going to pay more, though, than the people on the duplexes and on the sixplexes. And I personally think that you shouldn't make people pay for things they don't really want to buy. And if I don't want to buy a big old yard and a big old home, then I should be able to have some options like a duplex or a fourplex or some of these light density options. So that is what we did in the legislature last session. I have a little example of a main home and then two accessory dwelling units. Accessory dwelling units or garden cottages, ADUs, they're kind of naturally affordable. We see most people when they rent them out, there's some evidence from Portland, about, I want to say 50% of them are rented out well below market rate, often for free, to a family member, to an artist, to someone they were trying to help out. And so they kind of tend to be this lower income option. Not always, but sometimes. So one of the things we did is House Bill 1660. I had a version of it in the House, but we killed mine for the stronger one. It legalized 2 ADUs per lot on most lots in a city. So you can have a detached and accessory dwelling unit by right. And we also put some restrictions on cities can't kind of push you away by making it too hard by saying it could only be 200 square feet. They have to allow for at least 1,000 square feet. And some other pieces too to take away some of the barriers. We also legalized, we did a missing middle bill that legalizes duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes in cities like Bellingham and some other larger cities than Bellingham. By right, you can go up to 6 if you build those 2 additional units affordable. And I think that that matters to the rest of the county, because when Bellingham doesn't build enough, people drive until they qualify, and they change the rural areas too. And so there are people that would rather live in Bellingham than out in the middle of nowhere or out in the county. But if you don't build enough in Bellingham, they get pushed out there. There's the saying that you drive until you qualify. We did a lot of work on condo liability reform. One of the things that I heard from builders was that if they want to build condos, they have to pay $1 million in liability insurance just because they know they're going to get sued. And so they have to kind of, the insurance isn't cheap if you know you're going to crash your car, right? Like those people, my kids, when they start driving, they're going to have to pay a lot in insurance, or maybe I'll get them a bike. And that ends up being resulting in only really high-end condos. So we tried to make it so that there's a right to cure. So if your condo is, if there's a real defect, you can still sue the builder, but you can't sue the builder over frivolous things. And if you do want to sue the builder over something kind of frivolous, the builder has a right to try and fix it first. So that kind of avoids litigation. We did a reform of taxes on housing and building materials, reduction in the complexity of permitting and appeals to permitting. Some good work that I think will take some time to see it through the legislature. We have some, I'm going to skip the public safety slide because I've been talking enough and it's warm. And so the way that I kind of see governance is we'll figure out where community values are, right? That is my first job, and that's why I say you should always come and complain to me about what is working and what is not. Because if you don't tell me what's not working, if you don't tell me what you don't like, I can't fix it. Then I think that I really try, and I'm known for looking things up in Google Scholar and bringing actual papers, which I don't think is an incredible skill, but the other legislators are like, wow, how does she do that? But I'm a researcher, so it's my job. I always try and find data and evidence. Sometimes there's not data and evidence to look at things when we look at potential solutions. This is something I've been thinking a lot about as an applied researcher. When they're not available, we should set up policies to better test and evaluate these programs. So we created an electric bike incentive in this legislature. So I think next year you'll be able to get $300 off an electric bike if you buy them, $1,200 if you're low income. And part of this program is the data of this is going to go to UW, and they're going to see if people riding electric bikes really does reduce traffic volume, if it does really reduce vehicle miles traveled. And I think that evaluation part is just a really, really key component, because we have so many subsidies and programs, and we don't always know if they work. And I think it's really important to know if they work. And if they don't work, I'm willing to kill them. I really like cost-benefit analysis. I think it's powerful. It doesn't always answer all the questions, but it comes to help you understand where a problem is. And then when you find an area where someone is struggling, one of the things that I spend so much time talking about community members is I like being able to identify what is in their way. When someone tells me I can't hire enough people for the restaurant, okay, how can we solve this? Like, that's sometimes my husband drives me crazy because he'll just want to complain to me. I'm like, how can we solve that? He's like, no, Sharon, I don't want the senator. I want my wife right now. Like, just listen. Everyone who's married has been in that situation or in a relationship. And with government, I think that's a really key component of it. I think that's a really important part. So I'm going to open up to questions, but also before I do that, I want you guys to know that I brought 2 Western Washington University professors with me, Tammy and Nabil, if you guys will raise your hands. Oh, that was fun. This community is the best. They are here with me because they are planners, and they do these great design charrettes around Whatcom County and around Northwest Washington. I sat in one that they did for Ferndale. They did one for Birchwood neighborhood before that. And I think that Point Roberts could really benefit from that. The students do a great job. They come out, they get to know your community, they answer all sorts of questions, and they come up with a synthesis. And so I really want to encourage you to say hello or reach out to them or give them a card and tell them to talk to you later about it. They'll be back, so if you see them back, if you miss them today, you'll get another shot at it. You can also send me an email and I'll connect you about that.